Faith without works is dead, but living faith is dangerous. Chapter 1. Faith without works. Most people believe they understand what faith is. They've heard the word. They've used the word. They've even built their identity around the word. But understanding a word is not the same as understanding its weight. Because in Scripture, faith is not presented as an idea. It is not presented as agreement, and it is definitely not presented as something that can exist without effect. Faith in Scripture moves. But what has happened over time is that faith has been redefined into something far more comfortable, something that requires no change, no movement, no cost, something that allows a person to believe without ever having to become anything different. And that version of faith is exactly what the system depends on. Because Babylon does not need people who reject truth. It can work with that. It does not even need people who oppose truth. It can manage that. What it depends on are people who hear truth and do nothing. People who agree but never move. People who recognize but never act. People who feel something but never change. Because as long as truth remains contained in thought, it never becomes a threat. And this is where the problem begins. Not with what people don't know, but with what they refuse to do. Because Scripture does not describe faith. The way most people have come to understand it, it defines it clearly, directly, without room for interpretation. Faith without works is dead, not weak, not developing, not in progress, dead, meaning it produces nothing. It changes nothing, it moves nothing. And something that produces no movement poses no threat. So if faith exists, but nothing changes, then what exists is not faith. It is something else, something that looks like faith, sounds like faith, feels like faith, but has no life in it. And the system is built to keep people there, comfortable, informed, aware, but unmoved. Because the moment faith produces movement, everything changes. The moment it moves, it separates, and that separation is where danger begins. So the question is not, do you believe? The question is, has what you believe changed what you do? Because if it hasn't, then no matter what it's called, it isn't alive. Don't explain it away. Don't reinterpret it. Quote the word. Faith without works is dead. And if it is dead, then it cannot move you. And if it cannot move you, then you are exactly where the system needs you to be. Still. Chapter 2. The system's dependence. If faith without works is dead, then the question becomes, why are so many people comfortable with it? Why is something that produces no movement so widely accepted? Because what appears to be a personal issue is actually a system advantage. Babylon does not survive because people don't know the truth. That would be too unstable. It survives because people know and remain unchanged. Because knowledge without movement can be managed, it can be organized, directed, contained. But movement cannot, and that is the difference. The system does not fear what you hear. It does not fear what you agree with. It fears what you will do. Because the moment truth produces action, you step outside of control, and Babylon cannot function without control. So it does not need to remove truth. It only needs to remove movement. It allows teaching, discussion, and agreement, as long as none of it leads to change. Because as long as truth stays in the mind, it never becomes a threat. And this is why there are entire environments built around truth that produce no transformation. Places where the word is heard, the word is repeated, the word is acknowledged, but nothing changes. Not direction, not behavior, not life. And because nothing changes, the system is never challenged. Anything that teaches truth but does not produce action will never threaten the system. It can grow, it can expand, it can gather people, but it will never disrupt anything because disruption requires movement, And movement requires something most people avoid: cost. To move means to change direction, to leave comfort, to separate from what is familiar. And that is exactly what the system is designed to prevent, not by force, but by offering something easier: comfort, stability, routine, a version of truth that requires nothing from you. So people remain informed, aware, and convinced, but unmoved. And as long as they remain unmoved, they remain within the system, exactly where it needs them to be. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where faith is defined without movement. Show where belief alone is enough, because Scripture does not leave that open. It is clear. Faith without works is dead, and the system depends on people accepting that condition as normal. Chapter 3: Controlled Awareness. At this point, the issue is no longer ignorance. It's not that people don't know. It's that they know and remain the same. And that condition is not neutral. It is controlled, because awareness without movement is not freedom. It is containment. You can see it, you can recognize it, you can even explain it, but if you don't move, you are still inside of it, and that is where most people live, not blind, aware, but unmoved. They can identify truth, repeat truth, defend truth, but they do not become it. And because they do not become it, nothing changes. Not their direction, not their decisions, not their position. They remain exactly where they were before they knew, and that is the design, because a person who knows but does not move is easier to manage than a person who never knew at all. Why? Because they believe they are already aligned. They feel secure, settled, established, but nothing in their life reflects movement. Nothing in their life reflects separation. Nothing in their life reflects obedience. And yet, they are convinced they are fine. That is not freedom. That is controlled awareness. A condition where truth is present, but powerless, because it has not been acted on. And the system thrives in that condition, because as long as truth stays in conversation, in thought, in agreement, it never becomes disruptive. It never challenges structure. It never forces change. And anything that does not force change can be absorbed. This is why truth can be taught openly and still produce no transformation, because teaching alone does not threaten the system. Only movement does. And movement is what people avoid. Not because they don't understand, but because they don't want the cost. Because to move means something must change, and most people are not willing to change. So they settle into a position where they know just enough to feel secure, but not enough to act. And that position is exactly where Babylon wants them. Aware, but unmoved. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where truth is meant to be heard, but never lived. Show where understanding does not require obedience, because Scripture does not support that. It exposes it. And once you see it, you cannot pretend you don't, because now the question changes. It is no longer, do you know? Now it becomes, why haven't you moved? Chapter 4. What makes you dangerous? At some point, this stops being about what you know, because knowing is not rare. Understanding is not rare. Even recognizing truth is not rare. What is rare is movement, because movement changes everything the moment you move. You step out of agreement. You step out of pattern. You step out of alignment with the system that kept you still. And that is when everything shifts, because Babylon does not react to knowledge. It reacts to disruption. And disruption only comes from action, not intention. Not agreement, not emotion. Action. The moment faith produces action, you are no longer contained. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer stable. From the system's perspective, you become something else. You become a problem. Because what moves cannot be managed the same way. What acts cannot be redirected easily. What obeys truth cannot remain in systems built on compromise. And that is where separation begins. Not when you understand, when you move. Because movement forces decisions, change, loss, exposure. It breaks comfort, it breaks routine, it breaks patterns that kept you in place. And that is why most people don't do it. Not because they don't see, but because they understand what it will cost. Because once you move, you cannot pretend you didn't. Once you act, you cannot return to ignorance. Once you separate, you cannot remain where you were. And that is where danger begins. Not danger as weakness, danger as identification. Because now, you are no longer blending in. You are no longer silent. You are no longer participating the way you once did. And that exposes everything around you. Not because you said something, but because you changed something. And change is what the system cannot absorb easily. That is why movement is resisted. That is why action is delayed. That is why people stay where they are, even after they know. Because the moment they move, they become visible. And what becomes visible can no longer be hidden inside the system, if that's not true. Quote the word, show where obedience does not require action. Show where truth does not demand response, because scripture does not support that. It reveals something else. That faith, when it lives, moves. And when it moves, it separates. And when it separates, it becomes dangerous. So the question is no longer, do you understand? Now the question is, what are you going to do? Chapter 5, the expansion. At this point, we already know what scripture says. Faith without works is dead, clear, direct, unavoidable. But scripture does not stop there, because once something is established, it can be expanded. And when you begin to cross-reference, you begin to see something deeper, not different, clearer. Because scripture does not contradict itself, it completes itself. So if faith without works is dead, then what happens when faith produces works? This is where most people stop. They define it as growth, matured, progress. But script defines it differently. It defines it as danger. They that be fallen into danger are such as have works and faith toward the Almighty. Now the picture changes, because what was once seen as development is now revealed as identification, not improvement, exposure. Because the moment faith produces works, you are no longer hidden inside the system. You are no longer blending in. You are no longer contained. You are identified. And that identification is what scripture calls danger, not because something is wrong with you, but because something is no longer working on you. The system no longer holds you the same way. The patterns no longer shape you the same way. The influences no longer control you the same way. And that creates tension. Because anything that steps outside of control must be addressed, not ignored, not overlooked, addressed. And that is why movement matters. Because movement reveals position. It shows what you follow, what you obey, what you are aligned with. And once that is visible, it cannot be hidden again. That is danger, not weakness, not failure, clarity. Because now the system knows you are no longer operating within it. You are no longer governed by the same things. You are no longer stabilized by comfort. You are no longer controlled by fear. You are no longer contained by knowledge alone. You have moved. And once you move, you are seen. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where obedience does not create separation. Show where action does not reveal alignment. Because scripture does not support that. It reveals something else. That faith, when it lives, becomes visible. And when it becomes visible, it becomes dangerous. So now the question changes again. Not do you believe, not do you understand, but are you willing to be seen? Chapter 6. Keeping yourself. If movement makes you dangerous, then the next question is, how do you stay that way? Because stepping out is one thing, remaining separate is something else. Because the system does not stop. Once you move, it adjusts, it adapts, it reaches. Not always through pressure, but through influence, through familiarity, through comfort, through what feels normal. And that is why Scripture does not only speak about movement, it speaks about keeping yourself. He that shall endure the peril hath kept himself. Meaning something tried to take him back. Something tried to pull him in again. Something tried to reshape him into what he came out of. But it didn't work because he kept himself. Not by isolation, not by disappearance, but by refusing to be shaped again, by refusing to return to what once held him, by refusing to give himself over to the same influences. Because Babylon does not only control through force, it controls through attraction, through what people don't want to let go of, through what feels good, through what feels safe, through what feels familiar. And if you do not keep yourself, you will return, not because you don't know, but because something still has access to you, something you have not released, something you're still willing to compromise for. And that is how the system regains control, not by removing truth, but by reintroducing influence. Because what you do not resist, you eventually return to, and what you return to will begin to shape you again. So keeping yourself is not about avoiding everything. It is about refusing to be governed by anything outside of truth. It is about recognizing what pulls you, what influences you, what weakens your position, and refusing to submit to it again, because the system studies patterns, it learns behavior, it identifies pressure points, and it uses them. Not randomly, precisely. So if something still controls your response, then something still controls your position. And if something still controls your position, then you have not fully kept yourself. And that is why this matters, because movement without separation does not last. It becomes temporary. It becomes inconsistent. It becomes something that starts, but does not remain. And the system can work with that, because partial separation is not a threat. It is unstable, and instability eventually returns to what is familiar. That is why keeping yourself is required, not once, consistently. Because the moment you stop, something begins to pull again. If that's not true, quote the word, show where separation does not require endurance. Show where movement does not require discipline. Because Scripture does not support that. It reveals something else, that those who endure are those who kept themselves. And those who kept themselves are the ones the system cannot reclaim. So the question changes again. Not just, will you move, but will you remain? Chapter 7. The pattern. This is not a new pattern. What you are seeing now has already been shown. When the Most High descended, there was a response. Not from one person, from all of them. They saw it, they heard it, they felt it. The presence was undeniable. And in that moment, everyone was aware. But awareness does not produce movement, because when the moment came, they stepped back, not forward, back. They created distance. They chose separation from the very thing they were meant to approach. Not because they didn't see it, but because they felt the cost of it, the weight, the fear, the reality of what it meant to come closer. So they stopped. They remained where they were, safe, aware, but unmoved. And that is the pattern, not ignorance, retreat. Because when truth becomes real, movement becomes required. And that is where most people stop, not at understanding, at response. But in that same moment, there was one who did not step back. Moses did not step back. While everyone else created distance, he moved toward it, toward what was unstable, toward what was unknown, toward what others avoided, into the fire, not around it, not observing it, into it. And that is the difference. Not awareness, movement, because both saw, both heard, both understood, but only one moved. And that movement is what separated him, not from truth, from the people who refused it. Because once you move, you are no longer aligned with those who remain still. You are no longer part of the same pattern. You are no longer operating under the same conditions. And that is where separation begins. Not when truth is revealed, when it is followed. Because the moment you follow, you leave something behind, comfort, agreement, safety. Man, you step into something else. Responsibility, exposure, reality. And that is what most people avoid, not truth, but what truth requires. Because to approach is to change position, and most people are not willing to change position. So they stay where they are and convince themselves, and eventually others, that seeing is enough. But seeing without moving is the same pattern over and over again. Awareness without response. And the system depends on that pattern continuing. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where approaching is not required. Show where seeing is enough. Because scripture does not support that. It shows something else, that when the moment comes, you either step forward or you step back, and that choice reveals everything. So the question is not, do you see it? The question is, which direction did you move? Chapter 8. Why the system reacts. Once you move, something changes, not just in you, around you, because movement does not happen in isolation. It creates pressure, not emotional pressure, structural pressure, because the system is built on patterns, predictable patterns, repeatable behavior, expected responses, and as long as those patterns remain intact, the system remains stable. But the moment someone moves, that pattern breaks, and what breaks pattern creates disruption, not because it is loud, but because it is different, because now there is something that cannot be predicted the same way, something that does not respond the same way, something that does not align the same way, and the system notices that. Because systems are not passive, they observe, they adjust, they respond, not always visibly, but consistently. Because anything that disrupts pattern must be addressed. And that is when you begin to see it, not in theory, in experience. Pressure increases, not randomly, specifically in the areas where you moved, where you changed, where you separated, because the system attempts to restore equilibrium, to bring you back into pattern, back into alignment, back into what is predictable. And it does not always use force, because force is obvious. It uses influence, subtle, persistent, familiar. It brings back what you left, what you were comfortable with, what once worked on you. And if that does not work, then pressure increases, because what cannot be influenced must be tested. And that is where many people fall, not at knowledge, at pressure, because movement is easy to start, but harder to sustain when something begins to push back. And that push is not random. It is a response to your movement. Because now you are no longer blending in. You are no longer passive. You are no longer contained. And that creates friction, not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer aligned with what surrounds you. And that is why people begin to feel it. Resistance, not always from systems directly, from environment, from people, especially from some who are closest to you, from expectation. Because when you change, you expose everything that doesn't. And that exposure creates tension. And tension demands resolution. So the system applies pressure to resolve it, to bring you back, to make you stop, to make you reconsider, to make you question whether movement was worth it. And this is where the difference is revealed. Because the one who does not understand will return, but the one who sees clearly will recognize what is happening, not as coincidence, but as response. And once you see it as response, you stop reacting to it emotionally and you begin to stand in it. Because now you understand this is not random, this is confirmation. That movement has occurred, that separation is real, that the system has recognized you. If that's not true, quote the word, show where movement does not produce resistance, show where obedience does not produce pressure, because scripture does not support that. It shows something else, that those who move are tested, those who separate are pressed, those who act are seen, and that is not failure, that is evidence. So the question is no longer, will you move? Now it becomes, will you stand when something pushes back? Chapter 9. The pattern in full. Everything we've described has already been lived, not partially, completely, because there is a pattern in Scripture that does not just teach truth, it embodies it. The Messiah, Yahushua, did not come to explain the system. He came and walked outside of it, every part of it, not occasionally, consistently. And because he moved, the system responded, not after time, immediately, because he did not just speak truth, he lived it, and truth that is lived cannot be ignored, it must be confronted. That is why both sides reacted, not just one. Rome saw him as a threat, not because he was leading an army, but because he could not be controlled. He did not respond to power. He did not submit to pressure. He did not align with what governed everything else, and that made him dangerous, not politically, but structurally, because what cannot be controlled cannot be integrated, and what cannot be integrated must be removed. But it wasn't just Rome. The religious system reacted as well, not because they didn't recognize truth, but because truth exposed them. It exposed inconsistency, compromise, dependence on structure. Because when truth stands in front of you and you do not move, your position is revealed, and that creates pressure, not from the outside, from within. Because now there is a gap between what is known and what is lived, and that gap cannot remain hidden. So the response comes, not always as opposition at first, but as resistance, as questioning, as attempts to redirect, because the system tries to absorb what it can. But when it cannot absorb, it confronts, and when it cannot control, it removes. And that is exactly what happened. Not because he failed, but because he moved completely, because he kept himself, because nothing in the system had access to him, not pressure, not power, not influence, not even what others desired. And that is why the response was so strong, because he did not just step outside, he stayed outside completely. And that exposed everything, not by force, by presence, because when something true stands, everything false becomes visible. And that is what the system cannot tolerate. Not truth spoken, but truth lived. If that's not true, Quote the word. Show where truth can be lived fully and not be confronted. Show where obedience does not produce reaction, because scripture does not support that. It shows something else, that when truth moves completely, it disrupts everything around it. So the question changes again. Not just will you move, not just will you remain. Now it becomes, how far are you willing to go? Chapter 10. The response. When truth is lived, people respond, not always outwardly, but internally. Because when something real is in front of you, you cannot remain neutral. You either move toward it, or you begin to create distance from it. And that response reveals more than words ever could, because in that moment, it is no longer about what you say you believe. It is about what you are willing to follow. And this is where most people find themselves, not opposing truth, standing near it, hearing it, seeing it, recognizing it, but not moving. And that creates something that cannot be ignored. Tension. Not external tension. Internal. Because now there is a difference between what is known and what is lived. And that difference demands resolution. But instead of resolving it through movement, most people resolve it another way. They step back, not physically. Positionally, they create distance. They begin to question, reinterpret, explain away. Not because they don't see, but because they don't want to follow. Because following requires change. And change requires leaving something behind. And most people are not willing to leave. So instead, they adjust their understanding to match their position. And once that happens, movement stops completely. Not because truth disappeared, but because it was redefined into something manageable, something that no longer requires action, something that allows a person to remain exactly where they are, while still believing they are aligned. And that is one of the most dangerous positions. Not ignorance, but false alignment. Because now there is no pressure to move, no urgency, no response. Only comfort, and comfort removes confrontation, which removes movement, which keeps everything exactly the same. And that is why so many people remain in the same place, not because they don't see, because they have chosen not to move. And over time, that choice becomes a position, and that position becomes identity. And once it becomes identity, it becomes very difficult to change. Because now, movement is no longer just a decision, it is a disruption to everything they believe they are. And that is why people resist, not because truth is unclear, but because it is clear. Clear enough to require something from them. And that is where the divide happens, not at knowledge, at response. Because when truth is present, you either move or you make a reason not to. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where truth can be recognized without requiring change. Show where understanding does not demand obedience. Because scripture does not support that. It reveals something else, that those who see are responsible, and those who do not respond have chosen their position. So now the question becomes clear. Not do you recognize truth, but what did you do when you saw it? Chapter 11. The peril. At this point, the path is clear. Not easy, clear. Because once you move, once you separate, once you refuse to return, there is something you enter. Scripture calls it peril, not confusion, not uncertainty, but peril. He that shall endure the peril, not avoid it, not escape it, but endure it. Because this is where many turn back, not at truth, not at understanding, at cost, because movement has a cost, separation has a cost, alignment has a cost. And once that cost becomes real, comfort begins to call again, familiarity begins to pull again. The system begins to offer again what you left, not because it forgot you, because it recognized you. and it is attempting to restore you to where you were. This is peril, not just pressure. Conflict. Because now there are two directions pulling at you: what you have seen and what you came out of, what is true and what is familiar, what requires obedience and what requires nothing. And that tension does not go away quickly, because this is where endurance is required, not momentary strength. Consistency. Because the system does not need you to fail completely. It only needs you to return, to step back, to slow down, to reconsider, to compromise, even slightly. Because slight compromise restores access. And once access is restored, influence follows. And once influence returns, position begins to shift, not all at once, gradually, until what once felt clear begins to blur again. And that is why peril is necessary, because it reveals what you are actually holding to. Not what you said, not what you felt, what you will remain in, under pressure. Because truth without endurance does not last. Movement without endurance does not remain. Separation without endurance does not hold. And the system knows that. That is why it does not rush. It applies pressure over time, waiting to see if you will hold your position or return to what is easier. And many do return, not because they didn't know, because they did not endure. Because endurance requires something deeper than agreement. It requires commitment, not emotional commitment, position. Because once you choose to remain, you begin to see something clearly. This is not random. This is not coincidence. This is not just life happening. This is response to your movement, to your separation, to your refusal to return. And once you see it that way, you stop questioning the pressure and you begin to stand in it, because now you understand peril is not punishment. It is confirmation that you have left something that is trying to bring you back. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where endurance is not required. Show where obedience does not require standing, because scripture does not support that. It shows something else, that those who endure are those who kept themselves, and those who kept themselves did not return. So now the question becomes final. Not will you move, not will you respond, but will you endure when everything begins to pull you back? Chapter 12, The Decision. At this point, everything is clear, not comfortable, but clear. You have seen the system. You have seen the pattern. You have seen what movement requires. You have seen what it costs to remain. There is nothing hidden anymore, nothing left to explain. So now it comes down to one thing: decision, not feeling, not intention, but decision. Because knowing is no longer enough. Understanding is no longer enough. Even agreeing is no longer enough. Because all of those can exist without movement, and you have already seen what that produces. Nothing. So now the question is simple, not easy, but simple. Will you remain, or will you move? Will you stay where you are comfortable, or will you step into what requires something from you? Because there is no middle. There is no neutral ground. There is no place where you can know, agree, and understand and remain unchanged without consequence. That place does not exist. It only appears to, and that illusion is what keeps people still. But once you see it, you cannot stay there honestly, because now you know. And once you know, you are responsible, not for what someone else does, but for what you do. Because now the question is not what is true. That has already been answered. Now the question is, what will you do with it? Because doing nothing is still a decision. Remaining where you are is still a decision. Returning to what is familiar is still a decision, and every decision reveals alignment. Not what you say, what you choose. Because choice is where faith becomes real. Not when it is spoken, when it is acted on. So this is the moment, not later, not when it's easier. Now, because delay is how most people avoid decision. They wait for clarity, for comfort, for confirmation, but all of that has already been given. What remains is response. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where truth can be seen without requiring a decision. Show where understanding does not demand action, because Scripture does not support that. It demands something else, response. So now the question is final. Not do you believe, not do you understand, but what have you decided to do? Chapter 13. The moment of response. There's a moment in Scripture where everything we've talked about becomes visible. Not in theory. In action, the Messiah calls Peter to step out onto the water, not onto something stable, not onto something predictable, onto something that cannot hold him without faith. And in that moment, there are two positions, those who remain and the one who moves, because everyone heard the call, everyone saw what was happening, everyone had the same opportunity, but only one responded. Peter stepped out, not because it made sense, not because it was safe, because he was called, and for a moment, he walked. While everyone else stayed where they were, he moved into something impossible. And this is where people misunderstand the moment, because they focus on what happened next, but they miss what happened first. He moved, he responded, he stepped out when others stayed in, and that alone separates him. But then the pressure comes, the wind, the instability, the weight of where he is, and he begins to waver. And when he wavers, he begins to sink. And this is where most people stop the story. They focus on the failure. They focus on the moment where things didn't hold, but they miss what defines the moment. Because when he begins to sink, he does something else. He calls out, not to himself, not to what he left behind, to the one who called him, and immediately he is met. The Messiah reaches out and pulls him up, not because he never wavered, but because he moved, because he responded, because he stepped out when others stayed where they were. And that is the difference, not perfection, response. Because the ones who stayed in the boat never had to trust anything. They never had to endure anything. They never had to confront anything. They were safe, but they never moved. And that is where most people remain. Not because they can't move, but because they won't. Because they don't want to face what comes after the step. The pressure, the instability, the reality of what it requires. So they stay where it's predictable, where it's manageable, where nothing is demanded from them. And they convince themselves that they are aligned. But alignment requires movement, and movement requires response, even when it is not perfect, even when it wavers, even when it feels like it won't hold. Because the one who moves can be met, but the one who never steps out never will. If that's not true, quote the word. Show where faith requires no response. Show where calling does not demand movement. Because Scripture does not support that. It shows something else. That when the call comes, you either step out or you remain. And that choice reveals everything. So now the question is not, will it be perfect? The question is, will you respond? Final closing. At this point, nothing is hidden. You've seen it, not just in scripture, in pattern, in structure, in your own position. You've seen what faith is, not belief, but movement. You've seen what happens when it does not move, nothing, contained, safe, exactly where the system needs it to be. You've seen what happens when it does move, separation, pressure, peril, response. You've seen the pattern from the beginning to the end. You've seen those who step back and those who step forward. You've seen those who remain and those who respond. You've seen those who stay in the boat and the one who steps out. And now you know the difference, not in theory, in truth, because this was never about information. It was about position, where you stand, and what you are willing to do when truth is clear. Because now you don't get to say you didn't know. Now you don't get to say it wasn't clear. Now you don't get to say you need more time, because the pattern has already been shown. The call has already been given, and the response is now yours, not later. Now, because delay is how most people remain where they are. They wait for the moment to feel right, for the cost to feel smaller, for the pressure to disappear, but that moment never comes, because movement always requires something, and that something is what most people avoid. So they stay aware but unmoved, and that is the difference, not between those who know, but between those who respond, because not everyone who sees will go. Not everyone who understands will move. And that is where the divide is made, not by knowledge, by response. So the question is no longer, do you believe? The question is no longer, do you understand? The question is now final. What are you going to do? Because faith without works is dead, and dead faith keeps you exactly where you are. But living faith moves you. And once you move, everything changes. The ministry is the walk, not what you say, not what you know, what you do. Remember, brothers and sisters, our Father blesses motion and obedience to His word, so move and live. Shalom.